What's the most badass thing your daughter has ever done? I was at work when my daughter's teacher called me. Your daughter split her classmate's head open. She was throwing rocks at him. I went numb, not knowing what to say. I told her I'd be there immediately and started driving, angry at her but also at myself for clearly raising her to think this way. But when I got to the principal's office, my daughter was sitting there, hands dirty, blood on her uniform, staring straight ahead. Miss Yit, her teacher, was practically vibrating with rage. She attacked Veronica during recess. Multiple witnesses saw her throwing rocks. This is assault. The principal showed me photos. Veronica had a gash on her forehead, blood in her hair. We're suspending Dilly immediately and considering expulsion. This level of violence is unprecedented. I looked at my daughter. She wasn't crying, wasn't apologizing, just sitting there with her jaw set. Dilly, what happened? I did it, she said calmly. I threw the rocks. Miss Yit smirked. At least she's honest about her violence. She's suspended for 3 days, effective immediately. That night, Dilly barely touched her dinner. We need to talk about this, I said. She just shook her head. Dilly, you threw rocks at another student. You could have seriously hurt her. This isn't like you at all. Help me understand. You wouldn't believe me anyway, she muttered. Try me. Nobody believes kids like me when we tell the truth about kids like Veronica. While sitting beside me, she opened her phone and showed me texts she was getting from classmates. You're so mean. I'm going to throw rocks at you next. Group chats were lighting up with rumors, but there was something off about the whole thing. Alongside every cruel or threatening message from the girls in her class, there were other ones, kinder ones. Thank you. You're brave. We love you. Every single one from boys in her grade. Dilly, why are all the boys... You wouldn't understand, she said, putting her phone away. Nobody ever does. Over the next 2 days, I tried everything. Gentle questions during breakfast, firm conversations after dinner. I even called some of the boys' parents, but they just said their sons were going through something, and hung up quickly. Dilly, whatever happened with Veronica, we can work through it together. Like how Miss Yit worked through it when I told her. She snapped, then went silent again. By the third night, I was desperate. Her brother had gotten into 2 fights defending her. Parents were calling for her expulsion. I found her in her room, staring at her phone with tears in her eyes. Sweetheart, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. She looked up at me, exhausted. Dad, do you really want to know? Because once I tell you, you can't pretend it's not happening anymore. I held her hand and promised that I would never ignore her problems. She looked at me with exhausted eyes. Dad, Veronica's been cornering the 2nd grade boys in the equipment shed. She makes them pull their pants down, takes pictures, tells them she'll show everyone if they tell. I felt sick. Did you tell someone? I told Miss Yit 3 times. She said little boys make up stories about girls for attention. I told the principal. He said Veronica's a model student and I was jealous. I showed them Max crying, Luke with bruises from trying to get away. Nobody listened because girls don't do that. How long? 2 months. Yesterday I saw her dragging Ben's little brother behind the shed. He's only 6, Dad. 6. He was crying so hard he couldn't breathe. Her voice cracked. I yelled at her to stop. She laughed and said no one would believe me. So I picked up rocks. She showed me her phone. Screenshots of desperate messages from younger kids' older siblings, begging someone to help. Reports filed and dismissed. Even a video of Veronica grabbing a boy, but it was deemed unclear by administration. I tried everything else first, Dilly whispered. Everything. I went nuclear. When the police interviewed the younger boys without Miss Yit present, 5 of them broke down and confirmed everything. They found photos on Veronica's phone. Miss Yit was fired immediately. Criminal charges were filed against Veronica. Good riddance. Or so I thought. 3 weeks later, my Dilly came home with tear-stained eyes and a puffy face. I tried to comfort her, but her little arms shoved me away. You promised! You promised to help! You said you would! I blinked back the tears and tried to focus on solving the problem. Honey, what? She's back! Veronica is back! My blood boiled. Turns out Veronica's dad had donated $17,000 to the school, and now she was back and more indestructible than ever. Or so she thought. I looked at my daughter's face, all red and puffy from crying, and felt my teeth grind together. My hands made fists without me even thinking about it. This wasn't right, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the detective's number from before. My fingers shook as I pressed call and it went straight to voicemail. This is about the Veronica case at Oakwood Elementary, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She's back at the school after her dad wrote a check and my daughter is having panic attacks. I explained how Dilly wouldn't even leave her room this morning and begged him to call me back. About an hour later, while I was pacing around the kitchen, my phone rang. The detective sounded tired and frustrated when he spoke. I know this looks bad, but juvenile cases are complicated, he said. The donation timing is suspicious, but not technically illegal. He explained how the court system worked differently for kids, and how families with money always found loopholes. I wanted to throw my phone against the wall, but instead I thanked him and hung up. That evening, after Dilly finally fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I looked up every single school board member and started typing emails. My wife sat next to me, reading over my shoulder. Maybe take out the part where you call them corrupt cowards, she suggested quietly. We spent 2 hours rewriting everything. keeping the facts but removing the anger. The next morning, Dilly wouldn't get out of bed. She curled up under her blanket, saying her stomach hurt too much. I couldn't blame her one bit. I called my boss and told him I had a family emergency. Then I called the school and demanded a meeting with the principal that same day. His secretary said he was busy, but I insisted it was urgent. She finally gave me a slot at 2 o'clock. I spent the morning printing out every police report and witness statement from the original case. The stack of papers was thick enough to make a solid thump when I dropped it on his desk. The principal shifted in his chair and wouldn't look me in the eye. We have to follow due process, he kept saying. Everyone deserves a second chance. I pointed at the stack of evidence. What about the kids she hurt? He cleared his throat and mentioned something about a safety plan. Veronica has supervised recess now, he said. I asked for details, but he just repeated that they were handling it. Like you handled it when kids reported her before? I asked. He didn't have an answer for that. I left his office feeling worse than when I went in. On the drive home, I called my friend who worked at a law firm. He listened to everything and then gave me a name. Call Audrey Armstrong, he said. She specializes in education law and protecting kids. I called her office right away and explained our situation. She agreed to meet us that afternoon at 3:30. My wife picked up Dilly's brother from the school while I gathered all our documentation. Audrey's office was small but organized, with certificates covering one wall. She spent an hour going through everything we brought. The school violated at least 4 policies, she said, making notes on a yellow pad. We can file complaints with the state and federal offices. She explained our options while I wrote everything down. We left feeling like maybe someone was finally listening. That night at dinner, the phone rang. It was the principal again. Your son got into another fight today, he said. He punched a boy who called his sister a snitch. I heard papers shuffling on his end. If this happens again, we'll have to suspend him too. My wife's face went pale when I told her. Our son sat at the table with his arms crossed, not touching his food. They were being mean to Dilly, he said. Someone had to do something. I looked at my family sitting around our kitchen table. My daughter who tried to protect little kids and got punished for it. My son who kept defending his sister even though it got him in trouble. My wife who helped me write emails instead of sleeping. We were all exhausted and stressed, and the other family just kept getting away with everything. But we weren't giving up. Not when kids were still in danger. Not when my daughter woke up crying every night. Not when the school cared more about donations than safety. Tomorrow I would call Audrey again, and we would file those complaints. Tomorrow I would go to the next school board meeting. Tomorrow we would keep fighting, because that's what you do when your kid does the right thing and gets punished for it. You fight back. You don't let the bad guys win just because they have money. You keep going until someone listens and things change. The next morning I called the detective who worked our case and left a message about needing help. Detective Gian Schroeder called back within an hour and asked me to come to the station. I drove there while Dilly stayed home with my wife since she still refused to go to the school. The station smelled like old coffee and cleaning products. Schroeder met me in a small interview room with papers spread across the table. He explained that juvenile court works differently than I expected. Kids from rich families almost never face real consequences. The judge will look at Veronica's age, and her dad's lawyers will push for therapy instead of punishment. He showed me case files from similar situations where the kids got probation at most. I asked what we could do, and he leaned back in his chair. He told me to document everything from now on. Every incident, every message, every interaction needed to be saved and dated. Schools that let abuse continue can face lawsuits for enabling dangerous behavior. He wrote his direct number on a business card and promised to stay involved with our case. That afternoon, I searched online for therapists who work with kids dealing with school trauma. Most were booked for months, but one name kept coming up in parent forums. Dr. Greta Pritchard specialized in something called institutional betrayal, which is when schools fail to protect kids. Her office had a cancellation for next week. When I told Dilly about the appointment, she crossed her arms and shook her head. I promised she didn't have to talk about anything she wasn't ready for. She could just sit there if she wanted. She finally agreed to try one session. The therapy office was in an old house converted to medical spaces. Dilly went in looking angry and came out 40 minutes later looking tired. Dr. Pritchard asked to see her again next week. The second session was different. Dilly stayed in the room alone with the therapist for the full hour. When she came out, her shoulders weren't as tense and she actually ate dinner that night. Meanwhile, Audrey had been preparing our formal complaints. She came to our house with stacks of forms for the State Department of Education. There were more forms for the Office for Civil Rights at the federal level. Each form needed specific dates, names, and evidence attached. My dining table disappeared under piles of paperwork. Audrey explained that these complaints create an official record that the school can't ignore or hide. Even if nothing comes from them immediately, they establish a pattern for future cases. I spent 3 nights scanning documents and organizing evidence while my wife typed up timelines. The school board met every second Tuesday at the district office. I started going to every meeting, sitting in the back row with a notebook. Most of the discussion was about budgets and schedules. But sometimes they talked about safety policies and student discipline procedures. Other parents started noticing me there every time. Some would nod when they saw me, and a few even sat nearby. After the 3rd meeting, a woman approached me in the parking lot. She whispered that her son was one of Veronica's victims, too. Her hands shook as she explained that her husband works for Veronica's dad's company. She couldn't speak up without risking their income. She gave me her number and asked me to call if we made any progress. That weekend, I invited her and 3 other families to our house. We sat around the living room while our kids played in the basement. Each family had a similar story about reporting concerns that got dismissed. One mom brought a folder of emails she'd sent to the principal that never got real responses. Another dad showed us photos of bruises on his son that the nurse said were from normal playground accidents. We decided to meet every Saturday to share information and support each other. The online harassment started getting worse that week. Dilly's phone buzzed constantly with notifications from social media. Anonymous accounts called her terrible names and threatened to hurt her. Some messages included edited photos of her face on horrible images. We screenshot everything and sent it to Audrey for our documentation file. I helped Dilly block accounts, but new ones appeared every day. My son got messages too, calling him names for defending his sister. The bus became another problem when kids started throwing things at them. After my son came home with gum in his hair for the second time, I decided to drive them myself. I called my boss and explained I needed to adjust my schedule. He understood, but I could tell his patience was wearing thin. Every morning I left work to pick them up for lunch, then again after school. My vacation days disappeared fast. The other parents in our support group had similar problems. Their kids faced harassment at the school, while the adults dealt with subtle threats at work. Veronica's family had connections everywhere in our town, but we kept meeting, kept documenting, and kept pushing for change. The stack of evidence grew thicker every week. Audrey said we were building something the district couldn't ignore forever. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was at work, and the caller ID showed the district office number. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Allison Hutchinson from the compliance department and said she'd gotten multiple reports about safety concerns at our school. She sounded different from the other administrators I'd talked to, actually asking specific questions about dates and names instead of just making vague promises. She scheduled interviews with our support group families for the following week and asked us to bring any documentation we had. When I met with Allison in her small office downtown, she took notes on everything I said and made copies of all our evidence. She interviewed each family separately, spending over an hour with each one, and I noticed she kept going back to certain pages in her growing file. After 2 weeks of interviews, she called me back in, and though she couldn't share specifics due to the investigation, her face told me she'd found something big. She kept tapping a folder marked with the principal's name and Veronica's dad's company logo, and when she accidentally left it open for a second, I saw emails dated just days before Veronica returned to the school with dollar amounts highlighted. She quickly closed it, but gave me a look that said she was on our side. Meanwhile, Audrey helped us file official public records requests for all emails and communications between school administrators and Veronica's family. The district lawyer sent back a letter claiming attorney-client privilege and refusing to release anything, but Audrey wasn't having it. She filed appeals and sent letters citing specific laws that required disclosure of public records, especially when they involved student safety issues. The district kept stalling, sending incomplete responses and claiming they needed more time to review thousands of pages, which Audrey said was a classic delay tactic. During all this, Dilly had been seeing Dr. Pritchard twice a week, and the therapist called me in for a parent meeting. She explained that Dilly was showing clear signs of PTSD from both the original situation with Veronica and the harassment that followed. Dilly was having nightmares, couldn't focus in class, and kept checking locks on doors even at home. Dr. Pritchard wrote up a detailed report for our legal file, documenting the psychological damage and recommending continued therapy and possible medication if symptoms didn't improve. She also noted that Dilly's symptoms got worse whenever she had to go near the school, which was affecting her education. The next school board meeting was coming up, and I signed up for the public comment period. I spent 3 nights writing and rewriting my statement, making sure every word was factual and couldn't get us in legal trouble. When my turn came, I stood at the podium and read about how child safety was being sold to the highest bidder, how a $17,000 donation had more weight than 5 victims' testimonies. Several board members stared at their papers or their phones while I talked, and one actually got up to refill his water bottle during my 3 minutes. Only 2 members made eye contact with me, and one of them nodded slightly when I mentioned the investigation. The very next morning, a courier showed up at our door with a thick envelope from a law firm. Veronica's family was threatening to sue us for defamation if we continued speaking publicly about the situation. The letter listed specific statements I'd made at the board meeting and claimed they were false and damaging to their daughter's reputation. Audrey reviewed it that afternoon and helped us figure out exactly what we could and couldn't say legally. She rewrote my talking points to focus only on documented facts and official records, avoiding any statements about Veronica's character or intentions. 2 days after the board meeting, I got an email from someone named Orion Castillo, who said he was a journalist with the local paper. He'd heard about my speech and had been investigating similar patterns at other schools in the district where big donors' kids got special treatment. He wanted to meet but promised to protect all the minors' identities if we decided to go forward with the story. I was nervous about media attention making things worse for Dilly, but when I mentioned it at dinner, she surprised me. She put down her fork and said she wanted people to know what happened, that maybe it would help other kids who were going through the same thing. We agreed that I would meet with the journalist first to feel him out, and we'd make sure no kids' names appeared in any article. Orion turned out to be thorough and careful, asking for documentation for everything, and double-checking facts with multiple sources. That same week, 3 more families reached out after hearing about our organization efforts. One mom broke down crying in my living room as she described how her daughter had come home with bruises last week, saying Veronica had cornered her in the bathroom despite the supposed supervision plan. Another family had videos from the playground showing Veronica following younger kids when no adults were watching. The pattern was clear and getting worse, not better. The principal must have felt the pressure building because he released a statement to all parents about reviewing protocols and taking all concerns seriously. The letter was full of empty phrases about commitment to safety and continuous improvement, but didn't mention any specific actions or timeline. Parents started printing copies and showing up at pickup time, surrounding any administrator they could find, and demanding real answers about what was being done. The pickup line turned into an impromptu protest, with parents holding the principal's meaningless letter and asking when actual changes would happen. The next morning, I drove Dilly's brother to the school early for wrestling tryouts since he'd been begging me for weeks to let him join something physical. The coach took one look at him pacing back and forth in the gym and nodded like he understood what was happening. My son made the team that day and came home with a practice schedule and a list of gear we needed to buy. I watched him actually smile for the first time in weeks as he showed his sister the team shirt. That same afternoon, Detective Schroeder called while I was making dinner and said the prosecutor was looking at everything again. He explained that with the new victims coming forward and all the evidence about the school ignoring reports, they might be able to refile charges. He told me these things take time and asked for patience while they built a stronger case. I thanked him and hung up just as Dilly came into the kitchen asking what was for dinner. 2 days later, during her therapy session, I sat in the waiting room scrolling through work emails when Dr. Pritchard opened the door and asked me to come in. Dilly was sitting on the couch with tears running down her face, but she wasn't upset, just tired looking. She told me she'd been feeling bad about throwing the rocks, even though she knew she was protecting Ben's little brother. Dr. Pritchard helped her understand that she'd been put in an impossible situation where adults failed and she had to make a hard choice. We talked about how sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good, and that's okay. The school board announced a special session about student safety that Friday, and when I showed up, the parking lot was already packed. Inside the meeting room, over 50 parents were standing along the walls, holding signs that said things like, "Protect our kids," and "Safety over donations." The board members looked uncomfortable as parent after parent signed up to speak during public comment. When they tried to limit comments to 3 minutes each, the crowd started shouting until they gave up and let everyone talk. I recognized several families whose kids had been hurt, and they all told similar stories about being ignored. The board president kept saying they were reviewing policies, but nobody was buying it anymore. That weekend, Allison Hutchinson sent me an email with her preliminary findings, and it was worse than I thought. She'd found patterns going back 3 years of the school dismissing abuse reports, especially when the accused students had wealthy or connected parents. Her report recommended mandatory training for all staff on recognizing abuse and new oversight protocols with outside review. She also found that teachers who tried to report problems often faced retaliation or were told to drop it. Monday morning, a thick envelope arrived from the district's legal department with partial responses to our records request. Most pages were heavily redacted, but we could still see 3 previous incidents involving Veronica that were never properly investigated. One report from 2 years ago described almost the exact same behavior, but the case was closed after a meeting between the principal and Veronica's parents. Audrey called it a smoking gun for negligence and started preparing additional legal documents. That same week, I started getting calls and texts from parents who'd criticized us before. One mom showed up at our door with a plate of cookies and tears in her eyes, saying she was sorry for not believing us. She said her daughter finally told her what had been happening, and she felt terrible for trusting the school's version. Another dad pulled me aside at pickup and quietly apologized, saying he'd been wrong about Dilly. Work was getting harder to manage with all the meetings and phone calls I had to take. My boss called me into his office and asked if everything was okay since I'd been missing deadlines and leaving early. I explained what was happening, and he gave me 2 weeks to get things sorted, but made it clear my performance review would reflect the disruption. I started working late at night after the kids went to bed just to keep up with basic tasks. My promotion was definitely off the table now, but I couldn't focus on career stuff with everything else happening. Audrey spent a whole afternoon at our kitchen table drafting a demand letter to the district. She listed everything they needed to do, including removing Dilly's suspension from her record and implementing specific safety measures with real oversight. She gave them 30 days to respond before we'd file a formal lawsuit. The letter was 12 pages long and included citations to state law and federal regulations about student safety. I signed it, and she sent it by certified mail the next morning. 3 days later, the district's lawyer called Audrey and proposed mediation to avoid going to court. They wanted to meet with a neutral mediator to work out an agreement without admitting any wrongdoing. Audrey told me this was typical, but advised we should participate while keeping all our other complaints and investigations active. She said mediation could get us some of what we wanted faster, but we shouldn't drop anything else as leverage. The mediator they suggested had a good reputation for being fair, so we agreed to a session in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Dilly's brother was thriving on the wrestling team, and his coach pulled me aside after practice one day. He said he was proud of how our family was handling everything, and that my son was channeling his anger into something positive. He'd apparently told the coach everything during a breakdown at practice, and the coach had been keeping an extra eye on him. The other kids on the team had rallied around him too, which was helping him feel less alone. Dr. Pritchard scheduled an extra session with Dilly that week to work on something she called an impact statement for the upcoming mediation. I drove her there after school and waited in the lobby while they worked together for almost 2 hours. When Dilly came out, she was holding a folder tight against her chest, and her eyes were red, but she looked somehow lighter. She told me she'd written everything down about how this whole mess affected her, but she wanted to keep it private for now. Dr. Pritchard walked us to the car and mentioned that the writing process itself was helping Dilly take back control of her own story, even if she never shared it with anyone else. That same evening, an envelope with no return address showed up in our mailbox containing photocopied documents from a school district 3 towns over. The papers showed complaints filed against a teacher named Sandra Yitt from 4 years ago, where parents said she dismissed their kids' reports of bullying and abuse. One document had a note from a principal recommending she not be rehired due to her pattern of ignoring student safety concerns. I immediately scanned everything and sent it to Audrey, who called within 10 minutes saying this was exactly the kind of pattern we needed to show negligent hiring practices. She started drafting amendments to our complaints to include this new evidence about the school hiring someone with a documented history of dismissing abuse reports. 2 days later, I got a Facebook message from a woman named Carol, whose profile picture showed her with 2 young kids. She said she'd heard through other parents that we were fighting the school about Veronica, and she had something to share if we were willing to meet. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, where she brought a thick folder of her own. Her son had been in Veronica's class 2 years ago, and she'd found him crying in his room multiple times, refusing to say what was wrong. Eventually, he told her that Veronica was hurting younger kids during recess and making them do things they didn't want to do. Carol had gone straight to the principal with her concerns, but he told her that kids sometimes misunderstand rough play and that Veronica was from a good family who contributed a lot to the school. She'd tried following up 3 more times but kept getting the same dismissive response until she finally gave up and transferred her son to private school. She still had all her emails and notes from those meetings, which she let me photograph for our records. Audrey added Carol's documentation to our growing file of evidence, showing the school's pattern of protecting Veronica at the expense of other students. Monday morning, my phone started buzzing with texts from other parents asking if I'd seen the article in the local paper. Orion had published his piece about systemic failures in protecting children at local schools without naming anyone specifically, but using enough details that everyone knew he was talking about our situation. The article outlined how schools often dismiss reports from children, fail to properly investigate allegations, and prioritize donors over student safety. Within hours, the article had been shared hundreds of times on social media, with parents commenting about their own experiences with the school ignoring problems. The principal sent out a defensive email to all parents claiming the article was based on incomplete information and that student safety was always their top priority. The mediation session was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon at the district office. Audrey prepped us for 2 hours the night before, explaining that the district would try to offer minimal changes while avoiding any admission of wrongdoing. She coached us on staying calm and focused on our specific demands, which included clearing Dilly's record, implementing real oversight of safety reports, and ensuring Veronica couldn't return to the school with other students. The mediation room had a long table with the district's lawyer, 2 administrators, and a neutral mediator sitting across from us. They started by offering to remove Dilly's suspension from her permanent record and to implement new reporting protocols, but refused to acknowledge that they'd done anything wrong in handling the situation. Audrey pushed back hard, pulling out document after document showing the pattern of negligence and asking how many more kids needed to be hurt before they took responsibility. The administrators kept exchanging nervous looks while their lawyer kept repeating that they were there to find a forward-looking solution, not to relitigate the past. After 3 hours of back and forth, we took a break, and I checked my phone to find a text from an unknown number with an attached PDF. The document was a psychological evaluation of Veronica that someone had leaked, showing that evaluators believed she might have been victimized herself at some point and was acting out learned behaviors. My stomach turned reading it because it didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made everything more complicated when thinking about a kid who might be both victim and perpetrator. I showed it to Audrey, who said we couldn't use it in mediation since it was illegally obtained, but it might affect how we thought about our goals. That night, our whole family sat around the dinner table, talking about what we really wanted from all this. Dilly said she just wanted to feel safe at the school again, and for the younger kids to be protected. Her brother said he wanted everyone to know the truth about what happened. My wife and I agreed that fixing the system was more important than punishing Veronica, especially now that we knew she might have her own trauma. We decided our main goals were getting Dilly's record cleared, making sure real safety measures were in place, and keeping Veronica away from potential victims while she got help. The next mediation session went better, with us presenting a more focused set of demands. After another 4 hours of negotiation, we reached a partial agreement where Dilly's suspension would be completely expunged. The district would implement anonymous reporting systems with mandatory follow-up procedures, and they'd fund additional playground supervisors specifically trained in recognizing signs of abuse. We accepted the agreement while making it clear we were continuing our other complaints and advocacy work. 2 days later, the school board held an emergency meeting where they voted to reassign the principal to a desk job, pending a full review of his handling of student safety issues over the past 3 years. They also announced that Veronica would be placed on home instruction with a private tutor and wouldn't be allowed on the school property while other students were present. Detective Schroeder called that afternoon with news that the prosecutor had worked out a plea agreement with Veronica's family where she'd plead to lesser charges, but would have to complete mandatory therapy and have no contact with any of her victims for at least 2 years. The district called an emergency board meeting the following week, where they announced sweeping changes to their reporting systems. They rolled out a new anonymous tip line where kids could report abuse without giving their names, and every teacher would have to attend mandatory training sessions about recognizing signs of peer abuse. Several parents stood up during public comment to say our fight had pushed these changes through, and one mom grabbed my hand afterward to thank me for not backing down. A realtor friend texted me that Veronica's house had just appeared on the MLS listings with a quick sale price that was way below market value. Within days, the whole neighborhood was buzzing about how her family was packing up moving trucks in the middle of the night, and someone spotted her dad at the airport with one-way tickets to Colorado. The school counselor who had dismissed Dilly's concerns months ago showed up at our door with an official letter stating that all disciplinary actions against Dilly had been removed from her permanent record. She stood there on our porch looking uncomfortable, and finally said she was sorry for not listening when Dilly first came to her. Dilly stood behind me in the doorway and just nodded quietly before going back inside. During her therapy session that week, Dr. Pritchard called me in at the end to share that Dilly had asked about rejoining her art club at the school. She explained this was a huge step forward, showing Dilly was ready to reclaim parts of her life that had nothing to do with the trauma. We scheduled a meeting with the art teacher to discuss a gradual return. The stack of bills on my kitchen counter kept growing, and when I opened the latest invoice from Audrey, my stomach dropped at the total. I called her office expecting to set up some kind of payment plan, but she told me she'd already reduced her fees by 60% and would accept whatever we could pay monthly without interest. Her assistant mentioned later that Audrey had done this for 3 other families involved in the case. My wife and I spent a whole evening going through every social media platform, blocking accounts that had been sending nasty messages to Dilly. We deleted entire apps from her phone and set up strict screen time limits. The relief on Dilly's face when she realized she wouldn't have to see those messages anymore was worth any complaints about being disconnected. Allison Hutchinson's final report landed on the superintendent's desk with a thud that everyone could hear from the hallway. The document detailed every single failure in the system, from ignored reports to improper documentation and mandated quarterly safety reviews that would be conducted by outside evaluators. She told me privately that it wasn't the complete overhaul we'd hoped for, but having the failures officially documented meant they couldn't be swept under the rug again. The school started implementing the new safety protocols immediately, hiring 2 additional recess monitors who were specifically trained in child protection. They installed locks on all the equipment sheds and set up a buddy system for bathroom breaks. Parents at pickup started mentioning how much safer they felt, knowing someone was actually watching their kids. The superintendent's office called to invite me to join their newly formed parent advisory committee on student safety. They wanted someone who understood the gaps in the system and wouldn't be afraid to speak up. I accepted immediately, knowing that sitting in those boring meetings was how real change happened, one policy at a time. Throughout that week, parents of the younger boys started approaching me quietly at the school events or in the grocery store. One mom couldn't even get words out, just squeezed my arm with tears running down her face. Another dad shook my hand and said his son was finally sleeping through the night without nightmares. They all said the same thing in different ways, that Dilly had saved their kids when nobody else would. The wrestling tournament was packed that Saturday afternoon, and I sat in the bleachers watching Dilly's brother warm up on the mat below. Dilly sat beside me picking at her fingernails and trying to look like she didn't care, but I caught her watching every move her brother made. The ref blew his whistle, and the match started with both kids circling each other carefully. Her brother shot in for a takedown and got it clean, 2 points up already. The other kid squirmed and fought, but couldn't escape the hold. Another whistle, and they reset in the center. This time the other kid came in hard, but Dilly's brother sprawled perfectly and spun behind for another 2 points. The crowd was getting loud now, and I saw Dilly lean forward in her seat. Third period started with her brother on bottom, and he exploded up immediately, breaking free for an escape point. The final whistle blew with him winning 7-2. He jumped up pumping his fist, and then grabbed the microphone from the announcer. "This one's for my sister Dilly, who always fights for what's right." The whole gym turned to look at us, and Dilly's face went bright red, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. 3 days later, I walked into Dr. Chandler's office and sat down on the brown leather couch feeling stupid for being there. She asked me to describe what brought me in, and I started talking about checking locks 4 times before bed and scanning every playground for threats and jumping when car doors slammed. She nodded and explained that trauma affects everyone in the family, not just the direct victim. We spent that first session just talking about how exhausting it was to be constantly ready for battle. She gave me breathing exercises and told me that protecting my family didn't mean living in a constant state of war. The next week, she had me write down every time I checked something unnecessarily or felt that surge of protective rage. The list was 3 pages long. We worked on recognizing the difference between real threats and trauma responses. Slowly, I started sleeping better and stopped interrogating the kids about every detail of their school day. That Friday night, we all sat around the dinner table, and my wife had made tacos, the kids' favorite. Dilly's brother started telling this awful joke about a taco that walked into a bar, and we all groaned, but then he kept going with worse and worse puns until even Dilly was laughing. My wife told a story about her coworker's cat getting stuck in a ceiling tile, and suddenly we were all sharing random funny stories. Nobody mentioned lawyers or school boards or safety protocols. We were just a family eating dinner together, and it felt like something heavy had finally lifted off our shoulders. The last weeks of school passed quietly with the new monitors walking the playground, and kids actually using the anonymous reporting box by the main office. Parents at pickup mentioned how different the atmosphere felt with actual supervision happening. The principal sent out weekly updates about safety improvements and actually followed through on them. No incidents involving Veronica or anyone else hurting younger kids got reported. Teachers seemed more aware and present during recess. Even the bathroom buddy system was working smoothly. During her session with Dr. Pritchard that week, Dilly asked if she could talk about the rocks. I waited in the lobby while they met for 90 minutes instead of the usual hour. Dr. Pritchard called me in at the end and explained that Dilly had worked through some complex feelings about using violence, even when she knew it was the only option left. She understood that what she did wasn't ideal, but also recognized that she acted when every adult had failed those little boys. This kind of nuanced thinking showed real emotional growth and maturity beyond her years. Dilly nodded along and said she'd do it again if she had to, but hoped she'd never have to. Memorial Day weekend arrived, and both kids were buzzing about summer plans. Dilly had gotten into an art camp that her friend recommended, and her brother was doing wrestling camp plus swimming lessons at the community pool. They spread out brochures on the kitchen table and circled everything they wanted to try. My wife and I exchanged looks over their heads, amazed at how different they seemed from those dark weeks in winter. The cloud that had hung over our family for months had lifted into something lighter, more like cautious hope than constant fear. We signed them up for everything they wanted, and didn't mention that we'd used some of the legal settlement money to pay for it. August came fast, and the night before school started, we drove past to see the changes. New signs everywhere listed reporting procedures with phone numbers and QR codes. Extra staff members in bright yellow shirts walked the playground, even though no kids were there yet. The equipment shed had a giant padlock on it. Security cameras had been installed at every corner of the playground. The next morning, Dilly put on her new backpack and walked through those front doors with her chin up and shoulders back. Other kids nodded at her respectfully, and some of the younger boys' older siblings gave her little waves. She found her new classroom and settled into her seat like she belonged there. The teacher introduced herself warmly, and I could tell she knew Dilly's story, but wasn't going to make it define her. I walked back to my car thinking about everything that had happened since that first phone call about the rocks. We didn't get Veronica expelled permanently, or see her family face real consequences for their money games. The system didn't completely change overnight, and some people still didn't believe kids when they reported abuse. But we got something maybe more important in the end. Real changes that would protect kids going forward with actual oversight and consequences. A family that came through trauma stronger and more connected than before. And most importantly, a daughter who learned that her voice matters when she speaks truth to power, even when that truth is uncomfortable, and even when she has to pick up rocks to make people listen. Well, folks, that's it from me today. Thanks for sticking with me and letting me throw my thoughts and questions out there along the way. I really appreciate it. Like the video, it helps more than you think.